of webinars presented by Landfire and the Tallgrass, Prairie, Oak, Savannah, and Lake States Fire Consortia. Today's session is Assessing Needs with Tracy Hemilowski, a fire information specialist with the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savannah Fire Science Consortium. So what we have going here, during 2014, Landfire and consortium members of the Joint Fire Science Program have been working together to develop a series of webinars that provide information about landfire products and processes for large land management and planning. We started the three-part series in January on the West Coast with the Pacific Northwest group, then moved to the Rocky Mountains and concluded the first half of the year at the onset of fire season. We returned this autumn with the Southern Fire Exchange and with our friends here at TPOS and Lake States. Recordings of the previous webinars are posted in two places, on the Landfire YouTube channel and on the Consortia's YouTube channels. So you can check into those. All of our webinars are recorded. So as I mentioned, today is the second in the series. The third's coming up October 29th, and that's Customizing Data, when Don Helmbrecht, the Wildland Fire Analyst with the USDA Forest Service Teams Enterprise Unit, will be presenting local customization of fuels data on the Huron, Manistee, and Hiawatha National Forests. And there'll be a little bit about that at the end of this webinar. So I'm going to introduce Tracy now, and then we'll get started on today's webinar. Tracy's with the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She started working with the consortium in the summer of 2013 after completing her PhD at Louisiana State University. Her graduate work, conducted at Tall Timbers Research Station in North Florida, looked at how prescribed fires influence hardwood resprouting in southeastern pine ecosystems. That's a little bit about Tracy. It's in your hands now, Tracy. I'll step back and we can start your part of the webinar.
Okay, great, Jeannie. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on since I started with the consortium, and it fits really well into the idea of assessing needs. And one of the greatest things about this project for me, being new to the region, coming up here from Louisiana, is that this was a way we brought a lot of partners together. I've been able to meet people across the state and the region. We've been working really closely with the Landfire team, which has been fantastic. They're easy access. They answer questions, and it's been a very positive experience for me overall. And I'm happy to be able to share this with everybody today because it's been such a monumental task that we've all been involved in. And so a lot of times when I talk to people about this, we've been calling the project a fire needs assessment for the state of Wisconsin. And people wonder what a needs assessment really is. It seems like a strange term. And needs assessments are done by governments, communities, lots of different organizations to be able to address needs or gaps. So are the things that we're doing meeting our objectives? Or to be able to identify priority areas for action. And so this approach brought to prescribed fire has helped us to highlight some places where using prescribed fire might be the higher priority over other management alternatives or compared to other regions in the state. And starting the needs assessment, it seemed deceptively simple because the question that's at the core of this was simply how much prescribed fire do we need in the state and where can we use prescribed fire? And this seems really easy. We have a lot of data out there as to where the fire-dependent communities are, where people are burning. Individual landowners and property managers can provide numbers. But putting all of that together for the whole state gets really difficult when you're dealing with different data sets and different definitions. So we started with this simple question and a clean slate on our end. And one of the main reasons that this was probably brought to us by partners is because Michigan did a fire needs assessment several years ago, and people are really interested in having that kind of map on hand. It's a really great visual. It gets conversations started. And that's something that Jack McGowan-Stinsky was very involved in. And he's been involved with this project as well to give us some guidance and letting us know about the learning experience that they had. So I like to start off with our acknowledgement slide because it's really more than just the simple, thanks to folks who have been involved. This is, being able to thank everybody who was involved as the technical team and stakeholders. These are the people who made key decisions, brought in expert opinions, were able to answer questions, and you'll see that this spans the Fire Science Consortium, the university, the Forest Service, Wisconsin DNR, the Nature Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife. We gave everybody a seat at the table, and everybody's opinion was valid because for us it was about getting the best available product together and making sure that everyone who could potentially be using this in the long run, all of these different agencies, understood what we were doing and were able to let us know what was going to be most useful for them. The first key decision in this process was to use Landfire. And we decided to use the Landfire existing vegetation type layer. So this is a sense of what's on the landscape right now. There are other data products out there that we could have used. There's Wisconsin-specific GIS data. There are other national data sets. But Landfire had some advantages. And one of them is that there's a lot of fire information built in that people are familiar with that they could add on top of the assessment that we've done. Everything is really transparent and documented. It's free and publicly available, and it's something that will be updated over time. So we can take the product that we have now in 2014, and when Landfire is updated in potentially the next few years, compare and contrast the data sets and see where we might need to do a little more ground truthing or be able to report back to them of changes in the model that we've seen. And I think that that helps for everybody to really understand where the numbers are coming from and where we're coming from. There's also the advantage that Landfire is consistent from state to state, so if we were to combine this with the analysis for Michigan or to do a similar study in, say, Iowa or Indiana, Illinois, we can start to get a regional picture that's all based on the same data set. And that was something that was important to us as a regional Fire Science Consortium. On this map here, you can see that we have different color codes for the mean historical fire return interval, and so this is what's really, kind of built into Landfire. So we have really frequent fire return intervals of 3 to 5 years in the Northwest Barrens. You see frequent fire return intervals in the southern region and the central sands. There's a little pocket here in the northeast. And then most of the region north of the tension zone has fire return intervals of greater than 50 years. And because there's this really clear breakpoint between kind of a 25-year fire return interval and things that are greater than 50 years, this is the next thing that we brought to our stakeholders to think about what we wanted to focus on. The next big decision and key decision with our partners was the idea to focus on fire-dependent communities. And folks basically said, when we have these really long fire return intervals, that's something that people may not be thinking of managing immediately. Let's focus on fire-dependent communities. And we had to self-define fire-dependent communities for our purposes. So throughout this talk, when we talk about our fire-dependent communities, we're looking at natural communities in Landfire that have a fire return interval. Those fire return intervals are going to be less than 50 years. We're using broad community groups, so we've combined many of the EVTs into similar community groups, but are still splitting them out by larger ecological grouping. So we have, prairies are different from savannas, but we're not breaking out all of the savanna types that we possibly could. And something that was brought to our attention by our partners that we may not have thought of if we were doing this on our own in a vacuum was to include managed grasslands, so things like pasture. And these are areas that can be really important in the southern portion of the state where there are prairie remnants, there's grassland birds that are using those areas. So we wanted to include that because these are areas that are of interest for conservation, even though they may not be a natural community that's always a focus for fire managers. So if we look at the Landfire data and we pull out the vegetation that just has a historical fire return interval of less than 50 years, so those fire-dependent community types, pasture included, you'll see that we've now kind of dropped out most of the northern portion of the state. And so in later maps, when we're looking at the needs on a greater summary level, you'll notice that these are typically a low priority. And I'll remind everybody again that it's not because fire isn't important in those ecosystems. It's just based on our definition of fire-dependent communities at this point in time for this phase of the project. From that map and from this first step where we were able to say, okay, here are the communities that we're really interested in, we could get some kind of quick and dirty estimates. So if we were all to sit around with these big numbers that we can get out of the Landfire data and on the back of an envelope or a bar napkin do some quick calculations, we can get a sense of how much we should be burning using prescribed fire prairie ecosystems. We can look at the fire needs for savanna systems. We can look at even fire needs for pasture and managed grasslands. So we can pull those out specifically. So I'll give everybody a second to digest what we've got here. But let me explain what you're seeing. We have two columns, which are our major community groups. So we have community groups here on the left, and then community groups kind of at this midpoint. The next column over will be the total number of acres that we have in the state in the Landfire data that we're using. And if we divide the total acres by the historical fire return interval, we get a sense of acres per year that need to be burned. And these are ranked from the greatest area, which is actually managed grasslands, that makes up the greatest area in the state, all the way down to tall grass prairie, which has the smallest area represented in the state for a community group. These are some big numbers, and sometimes when people see these, they get a little concerned because managed grasslands are dominating the overall needs, and we're looking at millions of acres in this state. We really can't fathom that when most of us are working on smaller landscapes. So one thing that we can do right off the bat is pull out managed grasslands. Let's not worry too much about that right now. So now we're focusing on natural communities that we're a bit more familiar with. Still really big numbers. If we add those up, we get this sense of fire needs across the whole state in any given year. And we're looking at 750,000 acres. Including public and private lands. So this is everything that we've captured minus the managed grasslands. It's a big number. And again, this is something that sometimes I think scares people because they think, wow, like how could we ever burn that much? How can we manage that much of a landscape with limited staff, limited time, limited burn windows? And that's very true. And because of that, we needed to take the next step to be able to identify some priority areas for people. Because if we just throw this number and that map of all of the areas in the state that could potentially be burned out, nobody really knows where to start. And if anything, they just want to start on their piece of land. And it's difficult to be able to look at statewide priorities without focusing on the details. So to estimate the needs, we used a cost-benefit analysis. So this is something that you typically see in economic situations where people are looking for how can we get the most bang for our buck? How can we maximize our benefits while minimizing our costs? And it may seem a little strange to be thinking about the cost of doing business in conservation, but this is something that really does apply. Because we have more land to manage than we necessarily can on our limited budgets or with limited staff, so we should probably find the highest priorities we can. To adapt this for spatial data and ecological communities, we had to give some thought to, well, what are the terms that we would use if we're not necessarily looking at monetary cost? So what we did was look at some ecological benefits to managing the landscape, and we could weight this by community rarity. In place of that feasibility term, we decided to look at the challenges associated with management, in this case specifically prescribed fire. And then in place of cost, as far as a dollar amount is concerned, we use the term effort. And so the dollars per acre are going to vary from state to state, agency to agency. It's really hard to get a good number as far as how much does it cost to conduct a prescribed fire. So we said, well, there's probably a similar amount of effort. Fire return intervals are something that are going to determine effort. The site prep that people do is similar across the region. And so that's something that is going to help us to scale this without actually trying to plug in a dollar amount that people may not agree with. So as we go through this, we'll talk about benefits in terms of ecological benefits, challenges, and then effort. So I'll be using those terms a lot, and this is how they come together mathematically. We created indices for each term. So this is just another schematic instead of being the mathematical equation to remind you that we do have 4 terms: rarity, benefit, effort, and challenge. And to realize that they're all kind of on equal footing. We set this in a way where the benefits aren't so astronomically large that we're not going to be seeing differences when we account for things like effort and challenge. We also haven't set up the effort or challenge indices in a way that they can really overshadow the benefits and make it seem like this work isn't worth doing, that the effort is always going to be greater than the benefit. So think about these all on kind of equal footing. The first thing I want to talk about is our Rarity Index. So we base this on the Natural Heritage Inventory rankings for the state. You'll see in the central portion of the state is where we have the critically imperiled ecosystem, so in the central sands, if you're familiar with that part of the state. We also see the very rare and local and imperiled, this orange and yellow, up in the northwest Barrens and in the northeast. And then we do have quite a bit of green in the southern portion of the state. And those secure communities are really just the managed grasslands. Most of our natural communities are going to fall in the very rare and local, imperiled, and critically imperiled category. And this gives you another really good sense of just where things are located in the state. To calculate the benefit index, we use the Wildlife Action Plan that was put together for the state. And we did this for a couple of reasons. One of it is that we needed to just acknowledge that there are existing priorities. And to set prescribed fire priorities without thinking about priorities that people already are focused on seemed to be a bit disconnected. There's my arrow again. And so this lines up fairly well, actually, with where the rare communities are, too. You'll see in the Northwest Barrens, we have priority areas in the Wildlife Action Plan. In the central portion of the state, we have a lot of these areas that are existing priorities. And essentially what we said is if we have a fire-dependent community and it falls within an existing priority, there's a greater benefit to doing management within these regions. For our effort index, is that cost kind of index, we base this on the fire return interval and the number of patches that we were dealing with. So frequently burned systems, so things like prairies, you have to burn them every 3 years. Over the course of the next 50 years, or potentially 100 years, depending upon how long you want to kind of project into the future, you'll be visiting these prairie sites more often, and that's going to give them a higher effort index. We also looked at the number of patches that we're dealing with, assuming that highly fragmented landscapes were going to be a greater effort. If you have to go out and burn little 10-acre blocks as opposed to burning hundreds of acres in a day, it's going to take more time, it might take more staff, it's going to take more resources. So it's going to cause the effort index to be increased a little bit. And our last term is our challenge index. We base this on the wildland-urban interface data that's available from the Silvis Lab, our partners here on the UW campus. So they have maps for the entire United States. We pulled out Wisconsin, and they identify areas of wildland-urban interface. So this will be regions where you have structures, typically homes, that are within a vegetation matrix. And no surprise to anybody who's familiar with the state, up in the northern portion of the state where you have a lot of forests and inholdings and smaller communities and hunting camps, perhaps, that's where we see the greatest density of wildland-urban interface. We see less in the southern portion of the state. And some of this is based on how they've combined data and that they're not so worried about these pastures and managed grasslands as a WUI region. But that's going to influence where we see that there's a challenge. And we talked a lot within the group of partners about what the challenges are in dealing with wildland-urban interface. We've all experienced those burns where perhaps the homeowners are looking over the fence, or traffic is slowing as people drive by. These are things that we need to think about a little bit more when we're preparing prescribed fires or burn plans. It depends on where you are. You may have to actually go kind of door to door and put up flyers or knock and let people know what you're doing. It may be that you're restricted in wind direction. If you need a west wind to burn a unit, that limits the number of days that you have to conduct a prescribed fire. All of these things mean that it's not impossible to burn in the WUI area, just it's a little bit tougher, and we wanted to account for that. So with all of these indices, when we started to combine them, we had to find a good summary unit to deal with. We made the decision to use these HUC-12s. So these are USGS sub-watershed units. And you'll notice that the HUCs are different sizes. So we've got some really big ones here in the center. We've got a lot of smaller ones on the edges. It's just something to be aware of when I'm showing you how we've summarized the data, that it's based on the HUCs as opposed to counties or ecological landscapes. But the great thing about these is that they nest into larger units. So if we were to merge multiple states, we could kind of zoom out a little bit. And yes, you might lose, some of the detail, but it wouldn't look quite as messy if you were looking at 3 states together to be summarized on a larger HUC or a larger watershed. And so within each of these HUCs, when we're summarizing the data, so this is a simplified graphic for you, we're essentially looking at patches of communities on the landscape. So we have things like forest here in green, savanna here in brown, and the prairie in yellow. And then the overlap of our benefits, the Wildlife Action Plan Conservation Opportunity Areas, the existing priority areas, and our challenge index, the wildland-urban interface. And most of these are built very simply as far as the technical side of it goes, to be able to just look at, is there overlap or is there not? Do we get a little plus for this piece of prairie being in a wildlife action plan area? Do we need to give a little bit of a negative term to forest that's in the WUI? And when we have things that are split and they have kind of both a benefit and a challenge, how do we account for, a patch like this? And so it's kind of percent overlap and an additive mathematical process. When we look at the pixels, it gets a lot messier, but essentially this is what we were trying to capture. And if we look at one of our statewide maps for an index, this here is the effort index. The darker colors indicate HUCs that are a greater effort to manage. You'll see that we've got all these dark HUCs in the southern portion of the state. So areas that are highly fragmented and have high fire return intervals pop out as being high effort. Where we lack vegetation that we've included kind of drops out. So this northern portion of the state you'll see is a low effort value. And one of our areas that we know has kind of high benefits and high rarity, this Northwest Sands, that's something that doesn't show up as high effort. And so that's an area where there's larger tracts of land, so it's less fragmented, and it's a slightly longer fire return interval. So that's where we see some key differences in the vegetation when we start to look at these summary units. Rather than showing you all of the individual indices, I'm going to show you examples of what happens when we start to combine these. And here's that graphic again where we have rarity, benefit, effort, and challenge across the top. And we can combine them to look at things like what we're calling here the greatest ecological benefit. So areas that are high benefit and rare ecosystems, those should float to the top. Those are going to be the areas that have the greatest ecological benefit to using prescribed fire. When we look at that benefit and then try to balance the effort index, we get priorities that we've been calling kind of the greatest bang for your buck or maximum gain with minimum effort. This is just a way to account for areas where even though there's an ecological benefit, if it takes such a huge amount of resources to manage, maybe that should be a lower priority. And lastly, when we combine all four, we get our comprehensive ranking. So the comprehensive ranking will be areas that are high benefit to management with prescribed fire, minimal effort to managing with prescribed fire, and minimal challenge to managing with prescribed fire. And the first map that we're going to look at is this greatest ecological benefit. So if we pull that up, here the darker shades of green indicate our greatest benefits. And if you remember that map of rarity, you can see how those rare community types kind of pop out. So we've got, again, that Northwest Sands, the Northeast, the Central Sands comes out, and we have a lot of little patches down here in the southern portion of the state and along the western border. So given unlimited time and effort and money, these are the places that really need fire. When we pull in effort and challenge, so starting to account for real life, we can look at now the comprehensive ranking. And so this again is Highest priority areas are going to be in red. Lower priorities are this kind of off-white tier. And the red areas overlap a lot with those high benefit areas I just pointed out to you. So sometimes people see this map and can get a little overwhelmed. There seems to be a lot of red. So something that's important to note here is the breakdown of our highest priority to lowest priority areas are in 20% increments. So the red is going to be the top 20% of the HUCs as they're ranked when you list all of them out, as far as the numbers that they've got. So we get our indices added up, and the highest number is going to be, the HUC number 1, and we just go down from there and say, okay, here's our 20% cutoff. We're going to call those the highest priority. We move down from 80% to 60%. That'll be our next highest priority in the orange. Someone could get a hold of this data and take this map and adjust to that if they really wanted to focus on a smaller percentage of the priorities. You could look at the top 10%, you could look at the top 5%, whatever you wanted to. We just, for simplicity and keeping a color scheme that really stood out well, did this as a 20% quantile. Do this second map that I've got. It's the same map, but all of the HUC outlines have been pulled out of it, and we've overlaid some major cities just to help give people a sense of what they're looking at on the map. So if you have questions about specific things, we can try to direct ourselves based on some of the landmarks we have here. And I will also say that I am not an expert in Wisconsin geography. I've only been here for about a year, so I'm only really familiar with kind of the greater Madison area right now. Sometimes people ask me about very specific places that I have not been or seen on a map. In the chat box from Bob, he says, I wonder about whether there might be positive reasons to burn in the WUI to reduce fire danger, especially in the Northwest Barrens, so up in that northwest red portion. Yes, this is, I'm glad that you brought this up. This is something that we thought about in looking at our prescribed fire priority map and comparing it to maps that have been put together of areas that are great risk for wildfire. A lot of our priority areas and the risk areas overlap. And I think there's something to be said for doing fire management in the wildland-urban interface as a protective measure. So yes, there are the ecological benefits, but there's also a reduction in future wildfire potential. That's a great comment, and I'm glad that that came up. In this northern portion of the state, remember that while these may be a low priority for prescribed fire on our map, we are not saying that fire isn't important in these ecosystems. It's just a self-defined cutoff point. We'll move on. So in putting this together, we now have a great product. And it's a product that we think people could just take as is and roll off the lot. So in this case, like any car or SUV that you buy, you can just go drive it. It works. And our product works as far as providing some baseline numbers, some really rough estimates of how many acres of fire-dependent vegetation there are in the state and how often we need to be burning these areas. I think this is something that has brought a lot of people together to have conversations and build partnerships and start talking about challenges and ways that we can work together to meet a common goal. By including, everybody's land and not really identifying ownership, I think it helps for people to kind of step back and be able to say, like, well, we have a shared border, we have resources that we might be able to share, and working together, perhaps we can get more done. as Bob brought up, thinking about the wildland-urban interface, this might be an opportunity to target outreach, to find communities where education about prescribed fire might be something that's needed before you can get a lot of fire on the landscape. I know that people do a lot of work trying to educate folks about the ecological benefits of prescribed fire. Perhaps we can look at another angle and thinking about, well, if we use prescribed fire, we're reducing the chance for wildfire. And I think this also does a great job of demonstrating that there's a huge need for prescribed fire in the state. And I see a comment from Adam here about tools available to produce a similar assessment. We'll talk about that kind of here on our next slide. So in addition to just having this statewide map, which may not be useful for somebody who has one little piece of property that they're managing, this is something that I think we can modify for end user needs. So you can take that Jeep and you can do something ridiculous to it once it's in your hands. And I would like people to, as we move forward with this project, take our Jeep and modify it, because it really is just a starting point. Thinking about fine scale analyses is something that people can do as the next step. So you could focus on, it may be a specific property, like Adam is talking about here. It could be an ecological landscape within the state, but zeroing in and maybe adding some data to this to clarify either priority areas or potential issues in some of the underlying data would be great. That's something that can be reported back to us. We could also go bigger with this, and I've mentioned a couple times the potential to expand this to other states, to combine this with what's already been done with for Michigan. Something that has been brought to our attention multiple times, and some of you may be thinking too, is that we're using the historical fire return interval, and that doesn't really represent what's going on the landscape necessarily right now. Somebody could take this and zero in on a region of the state they're really interested in and adjust our values. So there are places that are in kind of a restoration phase using prescribed fire, where the historical fire return interval may have been 15 years, but it's being burned every 2 years at the moment to restore an ecosystem. Those are things that end users can do to modify the data and get a better sense of where their specific priorities are, reflecting the local conditions. It's really difficult for us in a statewide, very coarse picture to be able to try to make those changes. That's something that would need to be done on a smaller scale. And this is also something that we could add this to other planning efforts. Somebody who's working on a statewide assessment that wants to be able to account for fire in some way may be able to pull this in part of their plan to be able to say, well, we also want to look at the importance of where we can manage with prescribed fire and how that fits into our plan. So it's a starting point for folks to be able to make use of this. And just kind of wrap things up. So yesterday, Jack and Jeannie made fun of me kind of for not having an end slide and ending with a future plan slide. And this is because I don't see us wrapping up this product and making it available as the end of the process. There really is a future to this. The consortium is getting ourselves set up so that we can make this data available and share what we have with end users to be able to make modifications. We're submitting our methods to be able to back everything up with a peer-reviewed publication, so making the data available to share, but also giving people a reference and having something that's really solid to stand on. And we're also going to put out some products through the consortium. So for those of you who are signed up for our mailing list, you'll probably see things come up here and there about new products related to this fire needs assessment being available. So keep an eye out for that in the future. All right, and so there are lots and lots of questions coming in. I guess starting at the top here, we've got from Tom, this idea that fire is critical for oaks, but they don't seem to get a lot of support, and that there's potentially too much focus on wildlife. I think there is a lot of focus on wildlife, but right now, something that the consortium has been hearing, not just in Wisconsin, but region-wide, is that we really need more information about the role of fire in oak ecosystems. And we're hoping to really bring people together surrounding that issue and press folks to be doing more research on that. I think it's a huge knowledge gap that needs to be addressed. And this map even might support that to some degree, to get people really thinking about, well, where are the oak ecosystems located in the state, and where do those fall into the priority areas? From Mary, she says, is this a model that can be distributed in order to make the local adjustments you've mentioned? So yes, like I said on this future plan slide, we want to make the data and the mathematics and everything that we have done available for people to be able to make changes with. For folks who are really interested in that, we're not set up to really distribute via the website right now, but you could get in touch with me personally, and we could probably work some things out as far as getting some documentation to you and finding a way to make this available if you've got a need soon. So from Alan, so it's an interesting twist on a typical fire science outreach program project. What led the two consortia to do this? So Alan, this was, from my understanding, coming into this, something that partners and the PIs saw as a need from the beginning when the consortium was getting started. So kind of from day one, as TPOS was forming, people were saying, it's great that you're looking at fire science, but we're not even sure what's going on in the state. We don't have a good way to track who's burning where. We don't know what the highest priorities are. We don't really know how much we should be burning. So kind of from day one, folks were saying, we need a starting point. We need an assessment, and we've seen what Michigan has done, so could we do something like that? Can we get that map? And from there, we just kind of took the lead on it and brought everybody together. So from Sarah, she said, do you have plans for implementation and are measuring actual changes across the state in the future? So this is something that somebody who's working with the DNR, so in the Science Operations Center, sorry, my brain is falling apart on me. So Jed Munier is trying to get numbers to be able to get an estimate of how much prescribed fire is being used, and some GIS information or maps that he can make from that too, to be able to say, hey, these are the needs, but what's actually being done? So to kind of do a gap analysis on that. So it's not something that we're doing, but it's something that there is an interest for in the state. And we hope to see that, that we get that analysis done in the long run, even if we're not the lead on it. So fire return intervals concern me in grassland and savannas where the actual interval may be hard to determine. So this is from Bob. Yes, I would say that the fire return intervals that we're using in general have some questions surrounding them. It's really difficult to be able to look at a whole state and just slap a number on these community types. And that's where somebody could take this and focus on a specific area or an ecological landscapes and adjust the numbers with data that's available to them, or to be able to report that back to us and to the Landfire team to get a consensus on some of these values. It's tough to be able to just say, like, yes, prairies should be burned every 3 years, and don't think that we're saying that that's the end-all be-all of it. It's just that we had to be able to make some really coarse assessments and saying, okay, prairies on average need to be burned every 3 years is the best that we could do at this point in time. And so from Jed, if you look at the number of acres of prescribed fire needs in terms of rank, oak woodlands and forest rank high, prairie and savanna rank low. But yeah, we have more oak woodlands and forests accounted for on the map than prairie remnants, and they make up a large area that needs to be burned. And it may be something that I don't know if it's that those areas get overlooked sometimes because people are so concerned about prairie remnants and prairie species. There are also some challenges associated with that. I think it'd be really interesting to start to dig into where people are not burning and why. And so I'll take this last question and then turn it back over to Jeannie. Does the index increase, so from Josh here at the bottom, does the index increase the priority level? So does the value of WUI area influence priority levels, values at risk? No, we just consider things to be, I think the question that you're asking is, are some WUI areas ranked higher or lower based on what's in the area? Okay, yes, thank you. No, we're basically saying that dog houses are equivalent to mansions in this. Either it's a yes or no of is it WUI or is it not WUI. And again, it'd be really difficult to start to try to break things out on that statewide level. So we just had to say either it's in or it's out, and let's stop at that point as opposed to trying to figure out exactly what's in the WUI.
Well, thanks, Tracy. That was comprehensive. I put this slide up so you'll know everybody who's involved in today's webinar, and you'll have contact information there for Tracy and Jack and Craig. Those faces at the top are the Nature Conservancy's Landfire team, and you'll see the address landfire@tnc.org. That's where you can reach us. And I put a note up there about newsletter. We do send out a newsletter or bulletin every other month, alternating with what we call a postcard. That information is only news and updates, so it's not spam of any kind. And if you would like to get more information about Landfire or any of the other webinars or presentations, tools, data, et cetera, just drop us a line at landfire@tnc.org, and we'll be sure that you get into our mailing database. I'll back up here for a second. This is how you can find Landfire online, and the top address, as you can see there, is our mothership. It's the home, Landfire National at landfire.gov, only we're not calling it national anymore. It's Landfire Program at landfire.gov. As most of you probably know, that's where all the tools and data reside, and maps and access to the same. So that's the center of the power. The Conservation Gateway is where the Nature Conservancy's Landfire site is. We offer many tools, assistant application stories, bibliography, and other materials that you might be able to use as you're working your way through your needs. Then we're on Twitter, nature_landfire. If any of you guys are tweeting, be sure and start following us around, and we'll follow you as well. I mentioned our YouTube channel earlier. If you go Landfire Video on YouTube, you'll see we have at least 3 dozen videos up there now, tutorials, applications, case studies, and a few conference proceedings presentations, and we're continually adding to that. We're about to upgrade our YouTube channel, so we welcome you to check in on that and see what's going on. There's our email again, landfire@tnc.org. And then a preview of coming attractions with our group here at TPOS and Lake States. On October 29th, we end our three-part series when Don Helmbrecht is going to present local customization of fuels data on the Huron-Manistee and Hiawatha National Forests. The abstract that he provides us, off-the-shelf Landfire data, is intended to support broad sub-regional to regional scale strategic planning efforts, but maybe 3 to 5 years out of date at the time of application. Don's going to show how local knowledge and expertise can be used to update Landfire data for applicability at finer scales, with examples from work on these two national forests. Many of you will know Don. He's been with us through the webinar series all through 2014 and really knows what he's talking about regarding customizing data for local needs. So again, I'll put our contact information up here. Be sure and drop us a line if you need to know anything else. Thanks to Tracy and Jack. And with that, we'll end this particular webinar presentation. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.